Hello, everyone. So kicking off on our first day, we have the Youth Negotiators Academy, and they're going to be talking about bringing together top youth climate leaders working across the UNFCCC to explore how these approaches intersect, influence, and complement one another to tackle intergenerational justice and shape global climate policy. We will commence with a keynote address by one of the UNFCCC's top ambassadors, followed by a panel conversation between our leaders. The discussion will explore how, where, and in what way young people can have their voices heard and successfully embolden the climate action. Thank you so much, and please join me in giving them a round of applause as we welcome them all onto the stage.
Wonderful. Welcome, and thank you so much for honoring your presence here with us today to talk about meaningful youth engagement within the space as something very crucial and important. And I'm just inviting my fellow panelists to also join me on stage. May you allow me to start with a question? For whom is it the first time to be at the COP? Just raise your hand if it's your first time. Wow, beautiful. Well, thank you so much for coming on your first day of your first COP to this event. It's a big step, and it's probably a life-changing event regardless. So let me tell you a little quick story on my first time at the COP, and maybe you relate to it. I did a lot of preparation. I was in my studies, and I came with an activist group, an observer group, and I was here and I was like, I'm ready. I'm going to tell the people, I'm going to make my voice heard. But throughout the 2 weeks, I realized it's actually incredibly hard to make your voice heard. It's incredibly hard to engage in the process, and it's really challenging to feel that you actually contributed to something bigger than just being present and bring some pictures home. And when you're coming home and everyone asks you, how was it? And you're like, it was great, but what actually really happened? Maybe some people can relate to the feeling. So when I came home, I was actually quite frustrated, depressed. I was like, never again, I will come back at the COP. Well, you see me back, so I made it back. A year later, I came again to actually mentor more young people to come to the space. And I was like, if I can only tell them to take it a little bit light, to kind of choose one topic to follow, this might already be a success. So we can bring more people in to the space. Well, a year later, it's like, there is no way I'm going to fly to Chile because the COP was happening, COP29 in Chile. I'd rather give my pass and opportunity to indigenous young people in the space. Well, I got a call by the Office of the President of Switzerland, and they were saying that the president wants me to be part of the Swiss delegation. It's the first time a young person of Switzerland was asked to be part of the delegation. Also was not working for the government, so civil society in the delegation. And while we have been advocating for this for quite a while, for having young people part of the delegation, because we think it's the right thing to engage young people in the delegations, when I actually got the call, I told them there is no way I'm going to be in a delegation. I had like imposter syndrome and I was rejecting the offer. Later, fast forward, they convinced me and I joined. And why I'm saying all of this? I'm saying this because there are many different ways of how people can engage in the process. And I think that's the beauty of this space here, that there's so many different ways of how we can bring meaning, how we can collaborate, and how we can support each other and the cause we are all here for. So I joined the delegation. It was a great honor, but also was like a really, really challenging task when you think like suddenly I'm in this other side of the table. Now I have to represent my government, my country. What do I actually represent? Do I represent the government's position, the young people, the people in general, but maybe also the mountains, the glaciers, which are fast melting? So what actually is my role? And what can I advocate and lobby for? Now I have this privileged position to actually sit on the decision makers table, actually have this seat at the table we as young people have been advocating for over and over again. Maybe 2 reflections. First, I was one of the only young people in the room, and it was really challenging when you look around the room and everyone looks quite different from you. Everyone speaks in acronyms and you're like, ooh, can I actually ask a question? But also something which I can laugh about right now is that my delegation told me, under no circumstance, reveal your age. Because once you tell them you're actually 23 years old, no one is going to take you serious. I didn't tell anyone. But I think what changed over the last year is that actually we as young people can be proud of our age when we come into the rooms, that we can actually support each other and actually can bring in some difference. And not for generations against each other, age kind of it's an ageism, but rather how can we really lead in an intergenerational leadership? How can we support and bring the best of all the generations forward? So we as a collective of generations currently on this planet, but also taking the ancestors and the future generations into today, can actually drive this agenda forward. After the negotiations ended, when I was a negotiator, I became the focal point for Yango. I hope everyone heard of it. It's the youth constituency. It's the official way how young people engage in the process when they are observers, meaning they are not on the party delegations. And it's an incredible opportunity for young people to be heard and their voices to be brought forward. And there has been incredible progress as well on how young people, through the mechanism of Yango, can engage in the process. But there was something missing for me, because young people have always been seen as the outside the process. You are not on the table, but you kind of like, if we want to listen to you, we might give you like a voice. But something which really struck me was that very often we talk to decision makers, but once we left the room and they entered the negotiation, somehow our thoughts, our global youth statement, our recommendations were somehow forgotten, and they just talked about something else. I was like, we have to hold them accountable. We have to ensure that the voices of young people are actually represented at the decision-making tables. And that's when, for me, it was clear we need something to actually support young people in the decision-making process itself, in the negotiations. And with this mainstream, the youth participation and representation in the official processes. And that's why we came up with the Youth Negotiators Academy, which is co-hosting this event today. And that's also the acronym you're seeing on stage, the YNA, the Youth Negotiators Academy. The Academy has two overarching aims. One is to really enable young people to believe in themselves, find their voice, and be able to speak up when they have the opportunity to actually be able to negotiate. So they basically don't backtrack like I did when I got the opportunity to be part of the negotiations. And I'm incredibly proud, as I know some of the young negotiators are here in the room, while others are actually already in the plenary and in the negotiation rooms over there. And we do this through extensive capacity building. So actually people understand what these abbreviations are. Young negotiators will understand how to negotiate, how the process works, where these negotiating items stand, and you can actually ask them. They're incredibly knowledgeable and skilled. But also we invest a lot in community building. Why? Because it's not only about what you know, but also how can we work together. This is a consensus process, meaning that all the parties, all these almost 200 nations need to come to exactly the same language and no one can object. So that's why it's so important for us to actually build this network and support the young negotiators to actually find friends outside of maybe their, group of Latin America or the Pacific Islands. Because that's when we find consensus, when we actually have friends from other continents and other regional groups and we can talk to them in a friendly manner to overcome the deadlocks which we're seeing in the negotiations. Well, we also know there are systemic barriers in this space. Coming here comes with a huge burden, financial burden, specifically for countries which are financially challenged. And that's why we also raise funds to distribute travel grants to fully fund the participants to ensure that they can actually be here. And also we do advocacy. And that's why I'm so excited to actually kick off today at the Extreme Hangout and be here with all of you, as this is our first event. And also it's the first event here to really kick off this advocacy journey where we can bring different young people together and bring the ecosystem together for intergenerational leadership. As this is what we want to do, I would like to close my little opening remarks and then hand over to the incredible young people here on stage and hear their perspectives. I just wanted to close with that while we're entering into COP, I think it's really important that we're very mindful about how we're using and approaching words in the space. Because very often I still hear, we as young people have to be grateful for this dialogue and this opportunity. And I think we have to move away and also be proud and take the pride of how we are engaging, that we move to dialogue, to decision making. We are ensuring that young people are heard in decision making spaces. And the dialogues are, of course, also relevant, but we have to go a step further if we want to go for real ambition. But also seeing young people not as sole participants, but actually as representation of something bigger and larger, something which is kind of overspanning the whole world. As we all know, the young people of today are the world's biggest generation we are having. And it's so crucial that actually they are represented in these spaces. But also we are moving from sole youth engagement just because it's kind of en vogue and it's kind of a tick the box. We are actually moving to youth leadership. And how can we also strengthen this collective leadership? Because ultimately, young people, as everyone else, are not just stakeholders, but actually right holders in this process and have a right to be here and their voices to be heard. And with this, I would like to thank you once again and hand over to Charlie and the incredible panel. Thank you so much.
So firstly, thank you, Marie-Claire, so much for that opening keynote speech. I never tire of hearing how the YNA came about and the story of, where we've come from, how much impact we've made, and also where we're going. And that is really the basis of our discussion here today, is really thinking about the future of not just the YNA, but broader youth involvement in decision-making at UNFCCC COPs. And to be able to ensure that we have this continued growth and continued youth involvement beyond just ourselves, it does require a real critical reflection of what it means for young people to be here, to have a seat at the table, to have the skills and knowledge to be able to meaningfully participate. I'm sure it's something that everyone in the room is aware of, that tokenism is a big issue, that everyone wants to have, Greta Thunberg sponsor their organization or speak somewhere and then forget about youth, or even have a young person in their delegation, or, bring them to a space like COP and then not allow them to actually participate and represent young people. There's a lot of journalists here in the room, and please do us a favor and don't ask any young people whether they're hopeful or what keeps them hopeful over the next 2 weeks. We're tired of answering that question. We're here because we really care about the climate crisis, and we have a lot of knowledge to share, and we're representing communities that are doing the work and are often on the front line. And we want to be able to meaningfully share that, not only in the COP decision-making processes, but also around the COP venue as well. So to that aim, we're looking to have this critical reflection because the YNA is now in its 3rd year at COP. So we're really thinking quite deeply about these questions. One of our co-founders, YNA, has just written her master's thesis on the YNA, the impact it's having and how it can continue to build, so that other youth organizations can take our learnings and create more change. And we're having a little nugget of that critical reflection here today by bringing these amazing youth climate leaders together who in different ways are very much involved in youth decision-making, youth climate decision-making, and specifically decision-making here at COP. So with that said, before we get into the questions, I think we'll go along and I'll ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves. And very briefly, if possible, maybe in a minute, if you could talk firstly, just what brought you into climate action, and then what brings you to COP29 now, and how you were involved in COP decision-making here. Mohammed, if we start with you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for attending this session. My name is Mohammed Usraf. I'm a Palestinian gas and climate and political activist. I'm here with a delegation that I've been able to establish in the past few months. I'm a political activist, as I've said. I've been working on humanitarian support and leading a mutual aid network in Egypt, de-escalation of the attacks on Gaza. And I'm here representing youth from Palestine, but I'm here to also just represent youth in general in our fight for climate action. I think it's very sort of worthy to just know what really makes climate action what it is and what really is it, because I believe that there are multiple definitions, especially in this space where people cannot come to a very clear definition of what climate finance is, for example. I'm here to talk about climate justice. With my delegation, I'm here to talk about the illegal activities that have been harming the environment, but also the people, and it's unfortunate, but to also note how important the role of the people are in this world. There's extreme devastation that's happening all over in the Middle East, and I think it's very worth noting that it's our role here in the UNFCCC and at COP to talk about that and to see how we can try to get as many people involved in mitigating those damages as much as we can. So thank you, Charlie, for offering this space, and thank you, MC.
Thank you, Mohammed. Yeah. Siggy, if we come to you next.
Yes, my name is Siggy. I'm one of Denmark's youth delegates to the UN, but my journey started a long time ago when I was a small kid that became a scout. And there I learned about the value of nature and being in nature. And slowly this grew into an understanding of why it's important to protect it. So I got engaged in sustainability and therefore to environment and climate. And the Scouts are also one of the biggest youth movements in the world. Politics in Scouts is also a thing, and in the international level, it's also always. I learned a lot about this and how we can impact the world through youth leadership. So, when the position of being an official youth delegate under the Danish delegation opened, I applied at some point, and they thought that they could use me. So. This is my first COP. I've been to other multilateral processes. We also represent Danish youth in the CBD, in Biodiversity Cup, and at the plastic negotiations. But all this thing at the COP with so many side events and so many people, it's very interesting. And I'll see if I can fill out my position in full.
Thank you, Siggy. Denise, if we can come to you next.
My name is Denise Ayavare. I am the Executive Director of Better Life International Organization. It's based in Uganda, with operations in Ghana, South Sudan, and Tanzania. And it deals mostly in climate smart and sustainable agriculture, especially for refugees and internally displaced persons. Well, I am part of the delegation of the Climate Vulnerable Secretariat, the Youth Fellow. And clearly, I think how I joined climate space was because people usually talk about alternatives, but they don't talk about how affordable they're going to be or how accessible it's going to be for everyone. The alternatives sound really brilliant when you see them on paper. The policies sound the best when you see them on paper. But accessibility, affordability for someone in the global south, usually what they say, the global poor live in a world of no alternatives, is something that was really hitting hard. So I think at the age of 15, I moved a motion in the Parliament of Uganda about making them accessible to everyone, and likely why I went into refugees and IDPs. I'm from Uganda, and Uganda is the #1 host of refugees in Africa. And I usually believe I'm just an African holding a Ugandan passport. So, to talk about COP29 priorities, really, I think everyone has talked about it being a finance COP, but then more to that about Article 6, and that's carbon credits. Are they solutions to the African people or the global south people? Because why do I have to probably pollute in Brazil and come and buy some sort of, this is my opinion, and come and buy some sort of carbon credits probably in DR Congo or Uganda? So is it a false solution, and why should we able to adopt these solutions as Africans? So that aspect of climate justice and how it occurs or plays into our lives is what I'm mostly here for. And then to see if it's still a promise to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius, really. I don't know. I leave that to you. Do you think it's possible? And all the questions that come with it. Thank you, Chad.
Thank you, Denise. Benji?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, and congrats to Marie-Claire and the team for creating YNA and the incredible progress you've made in the last 2 years. So my climate journey started a few years ago around 6 years ago when I first started doing climate awareness in my school, in my community. But soon enough, I realized that change must happen at a much larger scale. And that's what brings me to places like COP. And that's what also has brought me to the multilateral energy space, where I have been working for many years now, because energy sector is responsible for 70% of global emissions. And if we don't tackle that part of our economy, we can expect for global warming to slow down. And I think for me, what is important at this year's COP is that we don't lose track of progress, because emissions continue to rise. And it's rather disappointing when we hear that people say, oh, I'm not coming to Baku because I'm preparing for Belém next year. Emissions and climate change are not looking at calendar the way we do. And we need negotiators to make things better today, but also every day in their capitals, in the governments. Me, in my role as the youth advisor to the UN Secretary General, I have the opportunity to work with him and the entire climate action team so that we push governments and other stakeholders year-round to increase their ambition and implement new actions from day to day rather than just during those 2 weeks every year.
Thank you, Benji. And finally, Enkun.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Enkun Bemtorch. I mostly work in the clean air space. So in the city that I live, 1 in 10 deaths is attributable to air pollution. And when I was in high school, my family members were very much so affected by air pollution in terms of health. And that's how I got into the environmental space. And quickly I realized that air pollution doesn't sit in this vacuum, that what we're breathing is not actually air pollutants, but it's actually the product of these systems, the same systems that are creating the climate crisis. And that brought me to the broader climate space. And so now I co-founded and run a nonprofit, the only nonprofit in Mongolia that's has the primary mandate to tackle air pollution issues in the country. But here at COP, I'm in my capacity as a youth negotiator with the YNA and their Climate Youth Negotiator program. So I'm here to represent not only the voices of youth, but also to ensure that Mongolia has representation in a lot of the negotiation rooms that we historically just haven't been able to be a part of the process. So my priority at this COP is to really understand how can countries like Mongolia with a small delegation with low human resources have better representation in negotiation rooms so that we have a stake at what's going on? And then how can we take on the outcomes that are happening at this COP and actually make them more local and more relevant to what's going on the ground?
Brilliant. Thank you, Enkun. That is really useful to get a bit more context about each of your stories and what's brought you into this space before we move into our conversation. And I will just say, to frame the discussion as well, today we're looking to have a very conversational panel. So I will pose some fairly open questions, and I think the panelists dive in, respond to what each other's comments, what each other is saying, and I think we should have a really interesting discussion. To add a bit more context as well to this youth movement we're seeing at the moment, I think it's good to sort of emphasize how recent it is in a lot of ways that we're seeing youth really formalized in the decision-making process. I mean, looking along our panel now, Siggy, you're a Danish youth delegate for climate and environment, a position that was only created in 2018. Benji, part of the Climate Change Youth Advisory Group, the first cohort was 2020, I believe. The YNA itself was only created in 2022, and the Palestinian Youth Climate Negotiation Team was created earlier this year. So, we're having this real moment of creating youth positions, often a youth version of an existing position, but in some cases, a completely novel youth position as well. And I think I first want to touch on a question of the extent to which young people in these positions are both able to and are truly representing young people around the world. And, Enkun, you've brought us into this conversation very well by touching on representation yourself in your opening answer. But I think it'll be interesting to hear your different perspectives on this, because you come to this conversation in very different ways. Representation will differ depending on your role. If you're a negotiator like Enkun versus someone who's very much here as a youth advocate like Siggy. And again, being a national representative versus a global representative, Benji, like yourself. And also, if possible, it'd be interesting to bring into discussion, other challenges to representation as well. Like, I'm sure we can appreciate the fact that representing young people in Palestine is going to be very different to other places in the world right now as well. And finally, as another thought to go into this conversation is, feel free to push back on this question to some extent. None of you are elected positions. To what extent do you feel, that you are responsible for representing all the young people in your nation or globally? And how best do you think you can do that? Very open question with lots of angles. So would anyone like to jump in first? Yeah, Mohammed, sure.
Can I go first? So I think those are all incredible questions. Props to you. It's incredible. And I think I would want to refer to what Inku and Denise said about just in general representation, but also false climate solutions. I think we are in an era of, again, false climate solutions. We are seeing that most of the funds generally go to militarization, other than the fact that we need to sort of push for demilitarization. We need to push for the end of environmental devastation in general. I think to answer your question very directly, I think my role as a youth representative or as a leader or a member of the youth constituency in general is I know that I have a lot of access coming here. I know that I have privilege coming here. My only role here is just to disseminate that access and ensure that there's equal representation and equal access to myself and others. So the goal here is to ensure that as many youth as can sort of be part of this process, and to highlight whether it's hypocrisy or highlight the opportunities that we can push for in the UNFCCC in the COP processes. In terms of false climate solutions, what I just wanted to say is that I think there isn't really, just in general context, for the Palestinian climate negotiation context, I think in terms of the NDCs, we cannot look at the NDCs there in times of war. We cannot look at climate change when we cannot even track what the gas emissions are in these times. And I really am unsure how to sort of look at that moving forward. The reason I'm here is to ensure that there's youth participation moving forward, and to ensure that we can at least highlight those issues within the UNFCCC space and the UN space and see how we can try to sort of institutionalize them a bit more. And I think that's the discussion sort of worth having. But in terms of, I just also want to refer to what Benji said in terms of energy, the energy sector as a whole. There's a major issue here, especially from a lot of states. Without naming states, I think there are a lot of issues with, again, just militarization. We see that there is this supplying of gas and oil that goes directly to just jets that continue to fuel the genocide. And I think that's just absolutely awful. I mean, that gas could be used elsewhere. The energy emissions could definitely be reduced. And again, this is a climate finance COP, but to an extent, it was also labeled the peace COP. So I'd love to see us pushing on the sort of peace mandate moving forward.
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed. And that's many important points that you're raising there. And we will come back to touch on some of those in a later question in terms of how we can leverage these positions. But it's interesting. You're saying that, young people, a big part of what we're doing here representing is to open more doors.
Absolutely.
I wonder if anyone else has a response. Enku?
Yeah, just to jump in that train. When I was thinking about this question, I think, how can you have climate engagement when you have disengagement with the systems that we have in general? And I think, especially in my local Mongolian context, I think that's a lot of the case, is that young people are in general have lost hope within the same systems that they live in. There was recently a study that came out from the Global Green Growth Institute. It was one of the first studies done in my country about climate awareness. And what it found was that young people in Mongolia are the age population that are most aware of climate change. And we talk a lot about awareness, but they're also the population that is least likely to take action. And I don't think that's something that we hear a lot, because we always talk about, as soon as we know and as soon as we're aware, we can take action. And what that made me think of is, there was the marshmallow study that came out, I think, in the 90s, where they gave kids marshmallows and they tested how many minutes they could go without eating it. And that was like a predictor of their success later in life. But that study was later kind of disproven by the fact that they had a larger, more diverse set of kids do it. And what actually was an indicator of being able to not eat that marshmallow at first instant and wait for the second marshmallow. So the condition was, if you don't eat the marshmallow in 5 minutes, you'll get 2 marshmallows after 5 minutes. And actually what a predictor was not some sort of self-aptitude or patience or anything like that. It was belief that after those 5 minutes, you will have a second marshmallow. And so kids who were not in a condition to trust that they will have the second marshmallow were more likely to take this first marshmallow. And I think that's the same thing with climate action. If you don't trust that taking action will lead to some sort of change, then there is no incentive to take action. And I think that brings us to that broader conversation that we're talking about, like climate action with intersections with peace, with intersections with gender, with intersections with young people. The reason why that's so important is because we're not just trying to fix disengagement within the climate system. It's disengagement with the entire system that is creating the climate crisis. How would you write?
Yeah, thinking about the difference between how much you know about climate and the climate action that is needed, and how they act themselves, and if they feel empowered to do so. It made me think about how important it is to be true to mandate when we are spaces like this, and how important it is when doing representation it's not something that we do here. It's something that starts way before, to gather outreach, to gather inputs, do outreach to youth groups, and make sure that we actually not representing just our own position, but representing the broader youth in a certain context. It can be in the Danish context, where I'm standing on the shoulder of the National Youth Council that have 80 member organizations. Pretty much all youth organizations in Denmark are members. And these members elect their local boards, elect their representatives to the Youth Council that ends up establishing the position paper that I take with me to COP. And I feel like I have quite a strong mandate on that. But I still know that it's not all youth in Denmark. It's only half of the youth that is representing through this structure. And I also know there's problems with the structure. We can also always improve in the way that we gather inputs forward. So I think that's some of the important parts when it comes to representation. I also want to touch upon that it's important when we are in these youth spaces that we are very clear on who we're representing. I know that I'm representing this group of Danish youth in the Danish position and beyond, in the Danish delegation and beyond, but also that when you are talking that you're not just being a youth advocate, you're not just talking on behalf of all youth, because youth is different. Youth is depending on national context, on their own context, on their a lot of different things. So, and we don't get that many opportunities if some of these actors can just take one youth in and say, oh, we got all youth covered. No, we need a lot of different youth, and we need to be clear about that.
I think there are some interesting questions coming out here about institutional trust and about the extent to which youth representatives can address that, and also about engagement and how we appoint these youth representatives that we have. Denise, Benji, I don't know if either of you want to come in on those points.
That should be okay. So I'm just going to say most of the times representation is subjective, and you cannot represent everyone that exists probably in Uganda or even in Africa as an African. I'm going to be talking about the African perspective, especially Uganda. So you look at even the young people who are here at COP from Africa or even Uganda, they can't represent that young person who can't eat because it probably rained and they can't have firewood. That's why I usually say that people who don't know the pain of looking for firewood to cook when it has rained shouldn't really be representing a certain group of people. Because when it comes to representation, you find that even within negotiations, what happens is that the lead negotiators, or probably that takes long. That is not even their priority at the moment. When you're talking about emissions, when you're talking about anything that affects them, how are they going to survive the next day? That is the question for them. And you find that those young people out there do not have that much representation. And then about institutional trust, really, I think most of us, the young people, really don't trust the institutions or even the governments that are existing. For example, we had a local conference of youth, and we had to develop a youth position paper. But imagine they asked for a youth position paper after developing the national position paper. And you clearly know you are developing something that is not going to even have play into what the national position paper looks like. They're just doing it, they're signaling, it's optics. They're just doing it as a formality. It's tokenism, like you just want to be at the table. And these are certain things that you look at institutions which should be able to support young people. They are not a true representation of what the young people need. And sometimes the priorities, sometimes the national positions do not align with us, the young people. They don't consult you because, like Mari said, there is a lot of ageism. And I think this still exists a lot in Africa. When you look in the room, there are very many Ugandans. And usually what happens is that you're just signaling, like the representation is not a true definition of what they need, of what they want. When you come to say something, they're going to say, no, you haven't seen anything. It's not even what you know. Like, we have been here for all these years. We know what is best. And that's why we usually say that any discussion without the youth is a discussion without the future. Because the young people, the future is now. It's not tomorrow. And we don't want to be included tomorrow or anyhow. The future is now. And that's what we usually ask for. We don't want to take over the tables. We don't want anything. We just want to have a seat at the table to discuss issues that also affect us, and not just doing it for formality or as a process or for accountability. Like, we want to have it in terms of action, not only advocacy. We should be past advocacy. We should now go into action. Even with climate finance, when you look at the global climate finance, only 1.6% comes to youth-led organizations, 1.6%. And these are young people that are trying to be innovative, that are trying to look for solutions. And if they don't get any support, there is no way we are going to have action, climate action, or even innovative solutions that exist. Everyone says, oh, youth, we like your energy, we like this, but they're not doing anything to literally support you institution-wise. And I think that's the biggest problem, to have young people even incentivized to continue doing what they are doing, because you sort of push them aside and you give them no incentive, zero incentive to even continue. And you make them frustrated. You meet young people, they just want to say, I'm not even going to be with my lead negotiators or anything. I'm just going to be on my own. You feel they don't want to even own their own delegations because they're not adding anything to them, those kind of institutions. So I think that's one of the things we need to break down to ensure that even at a national level or anything, the institutions include us even before we come to COP. So that by the time we come to COP, you agree on the national position, you agree on a lot of things, and you know what to do, instead of saying, oh, we meet at COP and corridors, and you're just telling me about the position paper. Oh, you're from Uganda. Oh, you're from this country. And that's all you do for me, really. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like you're drawing out lots of threads there of why this issue exists, right?
Yeah.
Ageism, the means that young people have, that more urgent priorities, and also where they are fitting into this process. Benji, I'm conscious of time. Do you have a quick remark on this?
Yeah, I think all those questions about representation really hit home for me, because sometime in March 2023, I got an email that said, the United Nations Secretary General invites you to join his youth advisory group on climate change. And suddenly I was one of the 7 young people out of the 3.5 billion people in the world who are considered youth. And I was going to be advising the world's top diplomat on his climate agenda. So the question of, am I really well representing the interests of young people and children comes up quite often. And I would like to offer maybe 2 thoughts on that question. I think first thing to keep in mind is that just speaking to any youth does not mean that we are necessarily doing the work to try to represent them. Because I could very easily just talk to my friends, college educated, upper middle class, or, this kind of group of people that is not necessarily the ones who are most impacted by the climate crisis. And for those of us in those spaces, it's a critical responsibility that we go out of our everyday communities and really try to connect with those who do not get this platform. Having that said, I think we don't need to overkill. Before joining the Youth Advisory Group, I was a focal point in a sister constituency to Yango that focuses on energy transition. And during those 2 years, I've spoken to thousands of young people to understand what are their priorities for energy transition, what they think about job creation, what they think about the pace of change, what they think about technological uptake, and what prevents them from scaling up their innovations and startups. And believe it or not, whether these were young people from Indonesia or Nigeria or Poland or Brazil, the responses were pretty similar. We as young people are definitely not uniform, and there's a lot of variability, but it is possible to distill some key trends and challenges. And we should focus on those common issues and try to tackle them, rather than keep reinventing the wheel and bogging ourselves down in endless consultations. They're great, but sometimes we need to move to the next step and actually make the change.
Yes, very much agreed on that front. Okay, well, I think with that, we should move on to the next question, which is looking at the fact that we have created so many of these official or formalized youth positions. There is a certain, lifespan on how long we can continue that part of this movement. There are only so many positions that you can create a youth version of, right? So I think we need to move, as Denise, you said, from advocacy to action. And I think there's a question of how we actually do that. How do we leverage these positions? And I think you've all touched on it in different ways. But I think there's 2 angles to this. One is how youth-led civil society should change in response to the fact that we have these formalized youth positions now, because for a long time that was something youth-led civil society was calling for. So how does it change its aims and its practices? And for those in these positions, many of you here today, how do you leverage that position to create action and advance youth aims, goals?
Yeah. Should I go?
Mohammed, jump in.
I'm just going to say this, and I think it's worth having a discussion as well with the rest of the panelists. I mean, you guys, why do you really think that we're using the label youth? I think the only reason we're youth is because we're under 35. If it gives you power, just using the term, all power to you, but I really don't think that's the right way to go about it. I think, Benji, you're already advising governments, and I think we're all either here representing our own governments or representing a lot of people. It's not even about representation. It's just about us taking the step towards action, whether it's climate action or just this idea of defining justice. The way I look at it is that there's no peace without justice. And then justice is a whole other issue of there's redistributive justice, intergenerational justice, and then also procedural justice. And I think we're here in our own decision-making processes and seeks to sort of push on the idea of procedural justice. And we do that through, for example, climate action and really just talking about reaching the finance or sort of filling the finance gaps in their own states or just in general. So what I'm thinking here is that let's talk more about how do we really define youth and why do we define ourselves as youth. The way I look at it is that there's no such thing as youth. It's a tokenizing term. Governments and organizations and entities and institutions just want to have youth because it's cool nowadays. And I really don't think that's the way to go about it. The way I'm leading my own team is that we're not necessarily a youth team. We're a climate negotiation team because again, we don't even have that much power as the state of Palestine. And what I'm really pushing for here is that we want to establish a larger institute focusing on climate strategy, focusing on talking about all these issues, whether within the UNFCCC processes or talking about climate action in a matter where we have a systematic shift. I think there needs to be a whole paradigm shift in the way we look at things. I think from this perspective, looking at justice, we need to recognize what justice really means and recognize the lack of justice all over the world. There is lack of justice to youth. There is lack of justice to indigenous people. There is lack of justice to generally vulnerable communities all over the world. And I don't want to limit us to just youth and we're kids or we're under 35. And again, just youth and children is half the population. So I really am against using the term just because it really diminishes us to an extent. And even if it doesn't diminish us, it gives us power because we're in a space that glorifies it or fetishizes it or so on and so forth. So I think we're all equal here, youth or not. And I think we all have different power. And what makes us sort of able to get here is the privilege and access that we have. And the way we look at it is that we want to use this privilege and access to the people that don't have the privilege and access. So you're part of climate action just to give back power to your own people and give back power to people who couldn't be here. And I don't think coming to COP is I fully think that being part of the negotiations is very important and pushing on negotiation items is really important. What happened today, for example, the potential of having I think it was Article 6 on carbon credit sort of approved without negotiations. I think that's atrocious. If there were more people, there could have been a bigger uproar about it. We could have had actions. So I think that's why we need more people in this kind of space because governments and systems do not recognize that we are against what they're forcing on us. So let's use the power of the people, youth or not. So that's my message, and I hope that answers your question too.
Yeah, that does very well.
Thank you.
And a couple really powerful points there. I think something that would be interesting to draw out maybe is, I mean, as a young person, I myself get frustrated with being put on a pedestal of youth, a young person. But I wonder if we are bridging where we are now and where we want to be. To an extent, as I say, you've all held youth positions. I've held youth positions before. I think there's a question of, would Mongolia have someone of your age, Enkun, in their delegation because of ageism and these issues without having that position, quantified, the YNA pushing for it? Same, would Antonio Guterres have someone of your age, Benji, as an advisor if this group hadn't been set up to make sure that was the case? And I think maybe there are two questions to pull here, right? Like, do we need this? How long? When should we measure that we don't need it anymore and we should get rid of this label of youth for the reasons that Mohammed has said? There's a couple issues floating around there. If anyone wants to,
I'm glad to take it. I really agree on you when it comes to the fetishization of youth, and that it is always very nice to have a youth that can come up and say this is going way too slowly, but we maybe still have hope, or we don't have hope. Something youth-ish, and they love that. But I also think it is due to us being good at advocacy and saying that you should be in that space. Of course, we have to ensure that it's meaningful and we get involved in a way where this is not the end point, but the starting point of the youth inclusion. I think for many of these constituencies, some of them, will not exist when it comes to marginalized groups because we will work together to get them included in these forums, in the decision making. So for me, it makes a huge difference to be a youth representative in this space because maybe it is almost half of the world being youth, but it's not half of the world's decision makers. And therefore, I don't think that the way that decisions are made reflects the democratic mandate that they should be made on, and therefore it's important to bring these views forward. I hope someday we won't have the need to have the same push to have youth positions or youth positions being under or like being in connection to like the real positions, you could call them, because we should just be included where it really matters, around the table, as we are in the Danish delegation, where we can come with our inputs. But I still think that there should be youth advocacy, as the youth voice will still differ, and it will still be a advocacy group, a group that needs to be advocated for specifically, and it will be different from the government position. So, I think that was my point for now.
Thank you, Siggy. And maybe if I can move the conversation slightly away from, how we should label these positions or whether we should have them, to, back to this point about how civil society should respond to the existence of these youth positions now. Denise, Benji, and Koen, I know you've all had extensive experience in civil society. What would be your recommendations for the ways in which youth-led civil society groups can leverage positions that they have access to, or leverage people in those positions to further their aims?
So a couple of things, I think here. Most of the youth-led civil societies have been frustrated because probably they do not have representation in policy or even budgeting processes, even governments being aligned with what they are doing. So I look at this as an opportunity for actually youth-led CSOs, because now they have someone who sits at the table and says, no, this budget should probably go here. No, this policy should probably align with what these CSOs are doing. Because I could say, you're doing a project probably in Africa, and your government doesn't give you any support or doesn't recognize anything, or there is no even recommendation that comes out of any event or any project that you're doing. Now, at least you have something to say. No, you have youth in those positions, in those formal positions, to say, this is what young people are doing. We need to spotlight this. We need more support for this. So I think it's more of an opportunity as compared to when CSOs were sidelined, governments were also sidelined. Now you have a bridge that brings together youth-led CSOs, governments, policies within these formal positions. And I think that's my take on that. Yeah.
Yeah, and Koen, come in on that.
I think maybe just trying to bridge the 2 points as well. I think, I don't know if there is a difference, but I think there is. I think there's a difference between like youth leadership and leadership that happens to be young. And I don't know exactly what the difference is, but one of the things for me is that leadership that happens to be young is kind of categorized into the sphere of youth leadership and not recognized as leadership itself. It's kind of recognized as a subset of leadership. So I think my recommendation would be to build that for CSOs and for parties, is to build expertise in young people so that they're not just young experts or experts of youth issues, but they're just experts that happen to be young people. And I think a lot of that is missing. YNA is a great example of this because they're training people who happen to be young to be negotiators and to be experts in the negotiating space. And it's really nice to see that people who are in the same cohort that I was last year are already leading delegations this year or coordinating their negotiation blocks this year. And they're not necessarily seen as, youth leadership, but they're seen as, leaders within their delegations who then happen to be young. So that would be my 2 cents.
And I think that feeds in nicely to the point that Mohammed was making earlier about the numbers of people here, right? Like it's a real capacity building question as well, that sometimes if you focus too much on just creating tokenistic positions, you're not actually advancing the reason that we're all here versus taking this kind of more meaningful approach and actually upskilling people.
Can I comment on one thing?
Yeah, of course.
I think so regarding and also to answer your question, because I know I avoided it, the whole idea of youth civil society participation. I think I'm not really using, if I were to be fetishized, I'd be fetishized. I'm 20 years old. I'd be fetishized for being 20. I'd be fetishized for being Palestinian. And oh, poor boy, he's came out of war or was in war once, or just the idea of, again, Palestinians are also glorified as, there's no middle ground of just, doing normal actions and really seeking justice properly. Now, in terms of my organization, what I want to do moving forward, it is youth led by coincidence. I wasn't, I didn't have you have to be 20 to 25. And it's also women majority or women led to an extent. So I'm also those things happen so automatically and so organically that I don't think we need to even sort of leverage them or push for them to exist. Now there's this whole discussion of quotas and affirmative action and so on. I'm not going to get into that, but I just think that in terms of youth civil society, we could be undermined because ultimately we all live in states that are either very bureaucratic or really, I cannot think of a single country that probably is fully democratic, especially in a world where I just don't see there's perfection in anything. So that is very normal. But representation is a very difficult topic. And in this case, just referring to what you said, I don't see a difference between youth leaders and leaders who happen to be youth. I think an argument that could be made is that youth are just younger and people that are older are more mature because they have, they've had more years to live. But I think education in this world is just very much accessible to people who are either, 7 to 15 years old or again, 30 and 40. So you can learn a lot at whatever age due to the access that we have. So again, there needs to be the systematic shift in terms of how we perceive and look at things because we're in a whole new world of it, or just new generational like media and so many other things. I think we're reaching a more sort of equitable justice, and hopefully we see that also in the climate processes this year. So yeah, I'll give it to Benji.
Yeah, Benji.
Yeah, thanks. I really like what you said, and I'm gonna kind of, I think, build on that because indeed I feel there has been a proliferation of youth positions, different advisory groups, and so on and so forth. But then we've seen many meaningful youth roles, like what YNA is doing, where we really try to, not we, the YNA is really trying to, all of us, it's really trying to bring youth into those important roles of negotiators. And so I'm a youth advisor. I'm not going to say it's a bad role. It's good to have it. Because I recognize that Secretary General's team would not go out of their way to arrange meeting with, quote unquote, random young people at COP. There are certain bureaucratic procedures with heads of state and heads of UN agencies. They need those youth to be pre-cleared and all those other unnecessary steps that stifle freedom. But anyway, we need those inroads into those important spaces. Having that said, I believe that they are only useful and helpful insofar as they don't obfuscate our pathways to take on real leadership roles. And to your question, how civil society, I think, should react and take advantage of this phenomenon is we should be pushing back on youth positions that prevent young people to taking serious roles. I'm, for example, not a big fan of youth parliaments. If you were to work year round on your youth parliament that has no legislative power, why don't you just run an actual campaign and go to real parliament? I think we need more young people as legislators, more young people as civil servants, and take other roles that are not easy to get, but are a hell lot more impactful if you actually succeed.
I think that's an interesting point you've made in terms of the national youth parliaments. And I should have given you forewarning that you're sitting next to the Prime Minister of Uganda's youth parliament. So, but before I let Denise come back, because I'm sure she has some thoughts on that, I do wonder to an extent that young people, when they're taking on these roles like youth parliaments or etc., a big part of it is advocacy, right? Like you're bringing together young people's views in quite a concrete way to be able to advance them. And I wonder to what extent that actually is different from like a role as like a UN youth delegate or like a youth advisor, right? That's kind of what you're doing. You're advocating for a position that has some sort of status to it, much like being a member of the youth parliament. And I'll let Denise.
So let me just clarify before. What I mean is that, again, it's about the demand on your time and capacity and how does it impact other pathways. I have nothing against someone being a member of youth parliament in general. What I maybe it was a bad term, but what I meant really is, if you have the opportunity to run for real parliament, I think it's a really important consideration to make, rather than just limit yourself mentally or have the actual parliament people tell you, no, you just go to the youth parliament. If that is happening, this is a problem. Yeah.
Look, this is the exact real talk that we're here to bring out, right? Like critical reflection of what it means to be young people in decision making. Denise?
Okay, interesting. So I think a couple of things. One is that I usually say I don't criticize national youth parliaments and all that. And I'm going to be a little bit biased, I would say. politics in the global south a little bit more commercialized. Yeah, for a young person to even run and be able to win a seat or a constituency, it's gonna be a gas. It's gonna be so difficult for them to even get to those positions. But I think Uganda has the best youth structures in Africa, and most of the countries come to benchmark on what youth structures we have. We have like the National Youth Council. You have the National Youth Parliament. You have the Uganda National Students Association. And all these are just, okay, I won't say, but at least they signal that young people have a certain representation and they can leverage those structures. For example, in the National Youth Parliament, if you move motions, those motions are discussed in the major parliament the next day. You have at least the speaker or the deputy speaker or someone like the prime minister sitting in those sessions to be able to take that. Because not every young person can run and be in the major youth parliament, yeah? So the National Youth Parliament means you bring together all young people across the region who all can't run for those positions, like Benji says, and they're able to talk about their thoughts. They're able to say what their reflections are, what they want. And it's an easier way to even at least get everything up there. So I don't think it is as much as you would want to say. Probably it has not worked in his country. In my country, it is actually functioning. And when it doesn't, we also have campaigns. Because I can't say anything. Our president has been in power for 37 years. But we are represented. It's like that. So I won't just say a lot about those issues, but with the National Youth Parliament, I think it's a reflection of what young people want, and those stretches actually take course. When you look at the positions, when you look at the activities, innovations they do, they work. What doesn't work is when it reaches up, I think. Yeah.
I think all of this builds on that we are on different levels in youth inclusion. And the most important thing is just always to be aware at which level you're on and how you can move on to the next one.
Sure. Yeah. And I think, this is really what we were trying to draw out when we, brought you all together today, is the fact that young people are so often seen as a monolithic group, right? Like we're all calling for the same thing. And actually these questions, the way that we answer them, the way that we approach them, it differs so much by region, by nation. There are common threads, the ageism issue, the fact that we don't have access to the same resources, etc. But, really it's very, very hard to even talk about these issues and talk about youth or young people because it's going to be so specific to each of our national contexts or our own communities. We have to wrap up fairly soon. I know we've been talking about marshmallows and it's coming up to lunchtime, so people are going to be getting hungry. But I wanted to go along the line and have 2 quick fire recommendations for the room and so that we can, share out on social media to a wider audience. The first recommendation I'm going to ask for is how young people here at COP29 can leverage the opportunity of being here, whether in an official youth position or not, to create change and advance the youth agenda, whatever their specific youth agenda is. Anyone can jump in first. Yeah, thank you.
I think having a strong sense of groundedness. Last year was my first COP, and I felt very up in the air because the process felt very up in the air, very high level, very separated from reality. Very much so, is this comma going to go before the word or after the word actually going to impact what's happening on the ground? So having that very strong sense of groundedness that what's happening in the negotiations and knowing like how is that going to affect our national policy, and that direct sense of impact, I think will really help to identify where your priorities are, who you should meet, what negotiations are most important to your priorities, etc.
Thank you, Enkun.
Okay.
Denise?
Yeah, probably before Benji makes me leave my party badge. Okay, so I think it's very important to notice that sometimes change at COP is not even made in the negotiations for young people, because you need a really great community. You need a great network that is going to help you build and grow whatsoever campaign you have, or whatsoever work, or amplify whatsoever work you have. So one of the things is that most of the friends that I've met, even Charlie or anyone that has helped me grow in advocacy, activism, or even my work, were at COP, probably not in the negotiation rooms, but through networking and getting to know each other's work. If I know what you're doing, how can I help you? If you have a social media campaign, how can I help you amplify that and all that? So try to network as much as possible as a young person to build networks that are going to help you grow, and you can grow them and amplify the work you're doing. Because outrightly, we all feel anxious about our future, even when we don't want the journalists to ask us that question, how hopeful are we and what do we expect to see at this COP? We're tired of those questions. Every time you have that question from journalists. Yeah. So we hope to grow our networks and also build our team so that we can amplify the work we're doing. Yeah.
Thank you, Denise. Siggy?
I know a lot of youth here think that they're imposters. They have the imposter syndrome, thinking that they're not qualified to be here, that they don't, there should be someone else in their place. And I just want to say that it's be aware of what you know. No one knows everything. We all know something, and together we know quite a lot. And be true to yourself about what you know. Ask questions. A lot of people are new to these spaces, and they grew when asking questions and being aware of that. And then have fun. It's gonna be a ride.
True. Enjoy it.
Yeah.
Just to add to the very practical recommendation, there's a world of resources here. The largest philanthropies, the largest companies, governments, important people. Just go out, talk to them, ask for help, and think what you're going to do for the next 50 weeks before the COP 30.
Plan. Okay, great.
So my recommendation is just that, again, youth or not, I think we all are calling out on very core issues, whether it's lack of accountability or just the fact that we're not very clear on our processes, whether it's lack of representation or so many other issues. I think we should hold ourselves accountable as youth. We should just do our thing. And I think what I mean here is that more practically, we should form alliances, whether it's a youth alliance, whether it's a global south alliance. I think there needs to be a reframing of the international justice framework. There needs to be a reorienting of the framework. I think the United Nations and so many other institutions and organizations are very just power imbalanced. I think there needs to be this reframing. And I think that's our goal here as youth. I think parties, for example, are probably mandated to their own very democratic values that they cannot really speak on so many other things. So what I'm pushing for here is that we are capable. And you know what? Let them glorify us and let them fetishize us. I think we can use that for our protection. We can use that to push for what we really think that we should do. And what I'm really pushing us to do here is that justice is not only in the climate space. We can definitely leverage the resources here, as Benji said, and we can definitely use it to so many other causes that go beyond this. And I think regardless, we need to form alliances for the greater good of the earth. I think there are so many issues that we should definitely touch on, and we all have the power. We're all here. And so let's work on that together with everyone in this room and beyond.
That's a brilliant recommendation. That would have been a good place to wrap up if I didn't have one more question. And this one, again, because we're quite tight for time, 1 minute recommendation with an eye back to the formal decision-making process here. How would you reform the UNFCCC decision-making process in any way? It can be broad, specific. If you were Secretary General for a day, perhaps, I don't know if the Secretary General can change the convention, but...
Should I go? Yeah. I just want to say that I really had wished that we spoke about the YCC and Youngo discrepancies. Why do we have two different youth representations now? And then we have YAG as well, and we have so many different youth groups that really I don't think they're coordinating as much as they should be. If I were to be Secretary General, I'd probably push for more tokenization. I think for the time being, we are tokenized anyway. Might as well. And over time, I think it's a way for us to show them what we're worth, whether it's young or old. And I think there's, again, youth, 20 to 35. I think that by itself is a huge age gap. But what I do want to say is that I think the PYCC should definitely push to have more youth on each and every party on their negotiation team. And moving forward, we could probably naturally see how they would eventually have more youth, young people, without forcing a seat. So, yeah.
Siggy, do you want to go next?
Yes. Touching on coordination, I think it's not just youth that should be coordinating more. It is across all environmental areas, the multilateral environmental agreements. As I said, we also go to the biodiversity COP, we go to the plastic negotiations, and very few people of the ones that we meet there, that we meet here, are the same. Actually, pretty much no one. And I think that's a shame because these things are interlinked, and the solutions to them are often similar. So if you think them interlinked, we can solve them interlinked.
Good one. Denise?
Okay, so I think a couple of things just to One would probably be about climate finance. I think we are taking a lot of time discussing very critical issues. Last time they said it took 30 years for loss and damage to be adopted within the core processes. So how long shall we take to adopt things like NCQG? And also, where did we drop the discussion of climate and health from last year's COP? I mean, these are discussions that really need to be included. When you look at how disasters affect us health-wise with the diseases and all that, I think those are discussions that you also need to include in the processes. It needs to be hastened because people can't wait for all those processes where you're discussing commas and full stops where they should be. I think we need to stop really that nonsense. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been taking notes, so I'll pass to the SG. I hope he can do something about it. Yeah, I think for me, the most important bottleneck for the UNFCCC process is that we are still hostage to the consensus approach. We are held back by petrostates and other countries who don't have the interest in ambitious climate agenda, phasing out fossil fuels and accelerating transition of our energy system to renewables. And we know that there are other UN processes and other multilateral processes that don't operate on consensus, like the Ozone Protocol, and they're moving ahead. We are seeing change happen, and I wish we could have this here as well.
Yes.
Mine, I think, might be on a more theoretical level, but so the UNFCCC is a party-driven process that respects state sovereignty. And I think we really need to question the kind of sovereignty that it's respecting in light of trying to respect the sovereignty of nations so that, everything is nationally driven. What are we thinking about sovereignty of local communities and indigenous sovereignty? And so the UNFCCC is a story that we tell about climate change to the world, and it's all up to interpretation. So I think we can reinterpret what the UNFCCC means in the kind of stories that we tell about climate action. And that is fundamentally reconsidering what we mean by a party-driven, a state-driven process.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Enkun. And thank you to all the panelists, not just for your, diverse recommendations, but also for your insights over the last hour or so. I think I've been coming to, a few of these COPs now, and there's just been a complete absence of proper critical dialogue, at least on stages between young people about this process, why we're here. Are we successfully representing young people? How can we be better? And it's a real privilege to be on stage with all of you and to get to hear your insights, and also in front of an audience that will hopefully ripple those insights on. So Mohammed, Siggy, Denise, Benji, Enkun, thank you so much for being here today. And just as I wrap up, I have to do a plug for the YNA, of course. So I just want to say, it's our third year now. We are working with over 80 countries this year. We have trained over 400 young negotiators to understand the process under the UNFCCC convention, UNFCCC process. We have over 100 negotiators here, 53 of who we have fully funded. We're so proud of our progress. We're getting bigger and bigger each year. We're now also at the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Desertification Convention, the UNCCD. And if you're interested to win the YNA, please find one of the YNA team members after this panel. And if you're interested in any of the other work that the panelists are doing, please find them as well. I'm sure they'll have a couple of minutes afterwards to chat about what they do in their work and why they're here. And finally, I just want to say thank you so much for coming to this panel. I hope you learned something about youth decision making, and take it forth. Thank you.